سخنان مایک پمپئو وزیر خارجه آمریکا تا ژانویه 2021.
It is a pleasure and an honor to be with you. Even in times as difficult as we've had these past few years, there remains so much to be grateful for in the United States. Here, we're free to associate with individuals who share our passions and our interests. Each person is free to worship God as they see fit. And we're free to debate those with whom we disagree. We're free to peacefully protest against actions taken by our government which we feel violate our rights. We cherish the dignity of every human life here and understand that it is the government that serves the people and not the other way around. So let's begin at the beginning, the revolution of 1979. Of course, the beautiful history of Persia could begin so much earlier, and to understand the civilizationally important history, the story must begin hundreds and hundreds of years before that. So one could pick other starting points. But at this moment, the revolutionary founding of the theocratic regime resides at the heart of today's Iranian conflict. This is the real fight, and it began in those frightful first moments of the revolution in 1979. This central fight is the one in the streets, and in the mosques, and in the minds of Iranians. It is the divide between the people and the organized opposition seeking freedom and democracy on the one side, and the entirety of the regime on the other. Look, I'm proud that I've been on the right side of this fight for over a decade now. As far back as 2010, I spoke of the Iranian people and their history, their kindness, their respect for reason, knowledge, and human life. They too are tolerant people. A homeland for Arabs and Jews and Christians and Muslims can be found on Iranian soil. Iranians want to prosper in their faith and protect their families. This is true in Tehran, as it is in Los Angeles, Austin, Nashville, or Kings Point. The regime, of course, is headed by Khamenei, Raisi, and the IRGC. It is revolutionary in its zeal. It is brutal. It is theocratic. It is craven and kleptocratic. Its leaders will kill their own by the thousands and then choose those who committed those massive atrocities to now lead their terror organization and their regime. Its leaders can shoot down a civilian airliner, killing hundreds of civilians, and think nothing of denying responsibility and hiding that black box from the rest of the world. Zarif, he wears a Western suit and speaks English with a smile. But he is a terrorist who would kill his own people to save the regime just as quickly as any of the other Ayatollah's henchmen. And now, Ibrahim Raisi. He will take on the role as the heir apparent to the faith and determined negotiator who conquers America by getting the immoral sanctions placed upon the people lifted and improving life for all. They, all of them, will keep the show going as long as they can. I'm confident the people in Iran won't let it continue because their audience wants this show to come to an end. The regime, they're prepared to use the IRGC, the Basij, and any tool to keep their grip on power. This misunderstanding, this understanding that there are no moderates, that they're all revolutionary, recognizes and ultimately results in the fact that this regime is largely unchangeable by American policies. But we can weaken them, and we did. The regime is at its weakest point in decades, with no ability to sell more than a few 100,000 barrels of crude oil per day, no money for foreign exchange. Less than 10% of their foreign exchange reserves continue to this day. Facilities blowing up all over the place, not only inside of Iran, but across the world and at sea. And the IRGC conquering hero was erased from the map of evil that the regime had used to keep down the patriots at home and those who wanted good things for Iran abroad. And we filled the administration, the Ayatollah, with a paranoia that was justified by the understanding that the revolution cannot be maintained forever and will not be. And the resistance forces inside of Iran, these noble Iranian patriots, are as strong as they have ever been and provide optimism to all who support them. You know, you can really see the effects of the last years in this past week's election. Ever more desperate, the fraud had to be increased, and the Iranian people know this. as does the Ayatollah. Since 1979, every election in Iran has served only to give an appearance of republicanism to a corrupt, brutal theocracy. The 2021 presidential election, however, is vastly different from those before it, primarily because it's taking place when the theocratic regime is at its most precarious state since 1979, and its prospects of survival are openly questioned by regime insiders and challenged by a restive, freedom-loving nation. In short, very few people actually voted for Raisi. This was a boycott. Turnout was the lowest since 1979, marking a total rejection of the regime and its candidate. It was, in fact, a boycott, and the regime knows it. They can publish whatever numbers they want, but make no mistake, turnout was insignificant, and the fact that this is a show laid bare for the entire world to see. This election is heavily impacted by a series of major social upheavals, including in 2017, in 2018, and 2019. Uprisings whose main slogan was hardliners, reformers, the game is over now, death to the dictator. This shakes the very foundations of the regime in its entirety. These uprisings demonstrated the Iranian people pinned no hope on elections as a conduit for substantive change, and the election of 2021, truly the selection of Raisi as the Ayatollah's president, proved this out. The program that we'd implemented also served to lay bare the regime's economic incompetence, systemic corruption, and frankly outright plunder of the country's wealth. And they've pushed 80% of the population below the poverty line. They see the corrupt theocracy as their true enemy and the first and foremost cause of the economic crisis. One of the most dominant slogans in the recent uprisings has been, "Our enemy is right here. They lie when they say it is America." The Iranian people must know it is not America. It is the regime. So what's ahead? What's the path forward? Look, as I said, the regime is at its weakest point in 40 years of existence. Iranians from every corner of the nation can see the failure of the regime to deliver on the very promises that it made. Its epic incompetence in handling COVID-19 is ongoing. Vaccination in Iran is at among the lowest levels in the world, not because the vaccine isn't available, but because the regime refuses to accept vaccines from those prepared to give them precisely what the Iranian people need. The regime's epic incompetence and quest for nuclear power has made it a pariah even among its fellow Muslim countries in the region. Its incompetence is simply ruining the nation, and it's resulted in shortages of food and gas and basic staples, making them unaffordable, and the nation's ability to respond to natural disasters like floods and earthquakes virtually non-existent. In short, Iran is not working, and the Iranian people know it. As for this Raisi fellow, he's not the president of the people of Iran. He's the president of the Ayatollah. His mission is clear: inflict pain, frighten, continue to loot and to plunder. Protect the clerics, protect the Republican guards. Look, he was chosen by the Ayatollah because he's just about 60 years old and thus could lead for the next 2 to 3 decades. This will give him the time he needs to get his own people into place and demonstrate that the supreme leader wants him to have some time to prepare for the next phase with the system in place. He'll use the IRGC and its Quds force to generate conflict externally, to deflect attention, and to maintain the narrative of the oppressed. This is how he'll behave. But it calls for a clear response. A clear response from the United States should take the lead to hold him accountable for the crimes against humanity that he committed. Any dealings with Raisi would be tantamount to dealing with a mass murderer. This is not only immoral, but also counterproductive. We should make clear to our allies in Europe and Asia, as well to make sure that they hold him accountable, and that if they deal with this man that sent thousands of his country to execution in a massacre in 1988, that the United States will hold them accountable as well. It's worth taking just a moment to note that the apologists for the regime suggest that Raisi's election and the power now in the hands of the, quote, hardliners, end of quote, is a result of American pressure on the regime. This is nonsense. It's obvious that Iran's leadership has been static or trending right for 2 decades now. No, what Raisi demonstrates is that the IRG generation is replacing the generation. Moreover, while Raisi and others have criticized the JCPOA, it doesn't impact them. It doesn't touch on any of their equities. Thus, they get to do the deal politically and reap the economic benefits from re-entering the JCPOA and get the resources that come from it at no cost to leadership. And so, Raisi is likely to complain about the deal, use that to gain even more concessions from a deal-hungry United States, but won't, in the end, block it, creating a clear pathway to a nuclear weapon. Look, the actions supporting our love of the Iranian people must begin by holding Raisi accountable for his crimes against humanity back in 1988. I know there are those in the audience who have had family that were killed in Raisi's massacre. 2, some of you have loved ones and friends currently imprisoned in Evin prison and elsewhere. And some who have had loved ones disappeared or worse. We will never forget any of them, and we'll pray for all of them. We must support the Iranian people. If we want to keep Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, we have to apply pressure until they change their behavior or until reforms which move Iran toward a democratic form of government take place. We can't shower the Ayatollah with money and economic benefits in the hopes that he won't use it to inflict terror. This thinking is foolish, dangerous, and backwards. I pray that the United States does not increase the resources he has at his disposal to empower the theocracy. Engagement with the regime will lengthen the time that the regime has to behave as it has for these past decades, denying basic human dignity and opportunity to the Iranian people. Look, I'm hopeful. The world has learned much about the theocracy in Iran these past few years. It's not that we didn't know it before, but we are afraid to confront it squarely. In Washington, D.C., there is much consensus, as evidenced by the overwhelming support for the sanctions regime that we put into place. And around the world, you can see that even in Europe, the tide of tolerance for the regime is turning against the regime. We must continue to support the Iranian people as they fight for a freer and more democratic Iran in any way that we can. There is so much good work that American civil society can do to further this goal. It is work that your organization is already engaged in. Keep up the fight. In the end, the Iranian people will have a secular, democratic, non-nuclear republic. I pray that this day will come soon, and with the support of Iranians living all around the world, and those who resist from within, that day will come sooner. I'm committed to this course. I know you all are too. May your mission be blessed and protected. May the Iranian people be blessed. It is a hopeful time and a time to redouble all of our efforts. Thank you for having me here today. God bless you, and may God bless the Iranian people.
سخنرانی شهردار رودی جولیانی.
Madam Rajavi, and all of you assembled in the name of justice, liberty, and the rule of law, good morning. And it is a good morning. I first want to take just a moment to personally thank you, Madam Rajavi, for giving me the honor to participate in something that's bigger than all of us, something that's more important than most of everything else we do, and that is to fight for freedom and to fight for liberty and to fight for justice. You don't get that many opportunities in your life to do something as important and as meaningful and as wonderful as this, to try to work as hard as you can to bring people to what God has intended for them, a life in which they have the ability to control their own lives, the ability to be safe, the ability to take care of their families, and to be left alone from the horrors that have been inflicted on the Iranian people by what can only be called a regime of terror, a regime of barbarity and terrorism that has done great damage to the whole world, but the most damage to the great and good Iranian people. And particularly to those at Ashraf, who were at Ashraf and now at the new Ashraf. I've come to love you. I think I speak for many, many of my colleagues. I know I speak for Dr. Maria Ryan. When we spent that time with you for a number of days and really got to know you, I do feel like you're members of my family, and I will fight for you the same way I fight for members of my family. And for an Italian American, you fight very, very hard for the members of your family. I hope we're members of your family. I hope we've earned that, and if we haven't, we're going to continue to try. I dream of a Tehran in which we can all be together and you can show me the beauties of your city, your culture, your civilization, and I believe we're much closer to it. The choice just made by the Ayatollah has, in many ways, to me, been an indication of just how fragile this regime is, just how close this regime is to collapse. At a time in which you're seeking renewal of an agreement in order to move forward with your nuclear program, that will also give you relief from stifling, crushing economic sanctions, to put in charge of your government not just a mass murderer. There are probably many mass murderers within the regime of terror, but one who's a prominent mass murderer, one who is identified as a mass murderer, one for which there are tape recordings of his being a mass murderer, and one who basically admits it, is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinarily stupid, risky. And these people are not stupid or risky. They are very, very shrewd, evil people. And we've seen a pattern of this, haven't we, Madam Rajavi and my colleagues? We saw it a few years ago in their attempts to assassinate us, and going so far as to including Iranian personnel, diplomatic personnel, in the groups that were coming to France and to Tirana to blow us up. That's a sign of desperation. That's a sign that you really feel that things are moving against you and you have to become as brutal as possible. Well, the selection of Raisi is exactly that. There'd have been many, many people that he could have put there that would probably be as evil as Raisi, but without the background and without but maybe there's no one he can trust as much as Raisi to be cruel, to be ultimately cruel, and to be so cruel as to terrorize the movement. Well, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. From the time the protest renewed several years ago, and President Trump, of whom I am very, very proud, did what President Reagan did. He approved rather than turned his back on him, as President Obama did, unfortunately, which I think delayed us greatly. From the moment that has happened, I don't know that the international world really understands how many protests there have been, how far they have gone, how they've permeated the entire country, and they've permeated the social structure of Iran. This is a regime that understands better than the world does, because the world has much of this censored by either a corrupt or foolish press that uses their propaganda and is dominated by it. But the regime understands with all of these protests that they can't seem to stop. And the kind of barbarity and the kind of homicidal, maniacal behavior they displayed in 1988, with Rahisi as a major player, they're still there. I mean, you saw it during these protests. Anyone who's a member of the MEK, even people they suspect of being members of the MEK, who may not be, just sympathetic. I mean, the luckiest thing they'll have done, they'll be in prison for long periods of time, and more than likely they'll be killed and shot, and sometimes right on the street. When you know that's going to happen to you, if I know I'm going to go into the street and I'm going to carry a sign that says, "We want Madame Rajavi," or "Down with the Ayatollah," or some of them a few years ago were carrying Trump signs. If you know you're going to be shot and killed possibly, and you still do that, can you imagine the strength of their desire to overcome this regime that had just gone too far, that had pushed them beyond what people can sit back and tolerate? And of course, you, Madame Rajavi, and your brave and wonderful movement, you're at the core of this. And for all of those who have said in the past that the MEK, the MEK is a cult, or it's a strange group, or it has marginal support, how can they say that any longer? You are an obsessive compulsion for Ayatollah Khomeini. You are an obsessive compulsion for Raisi. You are an obsessive compulsion for all of the criminals that run Iran, the war criminals and the rest of them. They have proven to us that you are a legitimate alternative. Oh my goodness, they even said it about a year ago. The Ayatollah said that MEK is the only group that can really threaten us. And yet we have so many in the West who close their ears to it. I heard it, I know it, you know it, and unfortunately, some of our people pay the price of that in the streets of Iran. When we reflect, as you have done so brilliantly, on what happened in 1988, that's the same regime of terror that we have today. And it may actually be at a point of desperation now that is very frightening, but also very encouraging. Let me conclude by saying something that, again, is discounted by many of the people in the press who seem overwhelmed by Iranian propaganda. You are ready, and by you I mean the collective you, Madame Rajavi, you and the groups that you have brought together so brilliantly. You are ready to govern tomorrow. This is unlike the other revolutions that we had. You know, when we went through the Arab Spring, and there's a question as to whether those revolutions were long-term good or bad, or were people ready? Were their groups ready? Were their groups ready to sabotage them? Here, if this regime is out, however it goes out, we're not going to have a situation like a terrible problem in restructuring the government like we had in Iraq. More time has to be spent on the media examining carefully what you have ready. You have a government in waiting with people of great expertise. I mean, there was a brain drain from Iran starting, 40 years ago. You got the benefit of that. Iran can get the benefit again. And you're ready to govern, but only on an interim basis, to the point where, as quickly as possible, there can be a free and fair election, which will include a lot more than 10% of the population, I assure you. This is not an attempt to impose on your great people their government. It's an attempt to keep it together for a short period of time, get it to function really well, and then to move on to, and we know the principles, and let me conclude with them. A government that is elected, that's a democracy, that is a government that will be fair to all genders, to all races, to all religions. You will have freedom of religion. and you will be non-nuclear. And a government that seeks to reestablish Iran and recapture and revitalize its great culture as a country of enormously talented people making great contributions to the world. And in the case of Iran, making certain that the horrors of the last 40 years are erased. The people who accomplished them are brought to justice. And the people who fought so hard, like all of you, and lost so much, are given an opportunity to lead out the rest of your life with what God guaranteed to you. You're not fighting for something the government gives you. You're fighting for something that God gives you. Freedom, rights, rule of law, and just a decent opportunity to bring up your children in peace. We're very close to it. The way in which the regime reacted to the premier of Slovenia's brave comments at the beginning is every indication that they are desperate. Madam Rajavi, you won this debate on the first day of this conference with the reaction of the regime. Now it's a matter of solidifying it. And thank you for letting me participate in it. And thank you to my colleagues from America, span Democrat and Republican, and show that all Americans are with you in your fight for freedom. We're willing to sacrifice as if we're fighting for our own freedom because we admire you so much and we know how much you can do for the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Giuliani, you demonstrated great courage and took many risks during the campaign to defend Ashraf residence and the Mujahideen. You faced personal attacks, but responded honorably and stood by your principles in defending the resistance and the right to resist. I salute you, and with Raisi now at power, you can lead the campaign to prosecute him and Khamenei for committing crimes against humanity and genocide, which the Iranian people, the resistance and the Mujahideen are demanding. Once again, thank you all, and God bless you.
سخنرانی جان بولتون.
Hello from Washington. Very glad to be with you, even though virtually this year, because it's an important time to discuss what's happening in Iran and what the future of the regime in Tehran is. You know, the world, of course, is talking about the recent election, and I use that word in quotes, of Ibrahim Raisi to be president. It's clear that this election was neither free nor fair. It wasn't democratic. The candidates were carefully screened by the Guardian Council. The debates and press were controlled. It was evident from the outset that Raisi was the Supreme Leader's preferred candidate, and they were going to take whatever steps were necessary to make sure that he was declared the winner. So no one should have been very surprised, and I think actually that kind of rigged election has a very negative impact on the perception of the regime around the world. The people of Iran were certainly not deceived. In effect, they boycotted the election, the lowest turnout since the revolution of 1979, and not just in Tehran, but around the country. So I think when you couple that very low turnout with the rising level of protests in 2019 and 2020, again, all around Iran, it shows just how fragile the regime's support is and how ultimately its survival depends on the Revolutionary Guards, not on popular support. The results of the election were rigged, and Raisi is an illegitimate president. Even more important, perhaps, he's not the supreme leader. In the West, I think it's misunderstood what exactly the president's role is. He's not the equivalent of the American president, and we shouldn't treat him as such. I think that the one good news that comes out of this election is that Raisi is not going to be the smiling face of the regime, as Hassan Rouhani and Javad Zarif were. I think he reflects exactly what the mullahs in Tehran mean to do, both internally in Iran and internationally. And it's really the international aspects I'd like to focus on here. I think the elevation of Raisi proves a number of very important points. Most importantly, that there's no moderation in the views of the regime or in their objectives around the world. I think you're going to see a continuation, and I fear even an increase in internal repression against the people of Iran, and a continuation and even an increase in belligerence internationally, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen. These are the kinds of activities that show the real objectives of the regime in Tehran. It's not peace and security in the region, it's hegemony. And we've seen through the arming of militia groups in Iraq in an effort to create a new Hezbollah in that country, the use of the Houthi rebels to attack civilian targets in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that the regime has no scruples, no intention of protecting innocent civilians against their attack. They are terrorists even when they engage in conventional military activity. And yet we've seen in the past couple of years in Europe and elsewhere increasing evidence that it is indeed the government of Iran itself, their diplomats, their officials, who are directing and aiding terrorist activities, including the attack that we all remember against the Free Iran rally of 2018, where we've actually seen the courts in Belgium convict an Iranian diplomat of terrorist activity. That tells you much about the nature of the regime. This group understands that, but this is the kind of message that we have to get out to the wider world. The election, I think, of Raisi also proves that making concessions to the regime will not change their behavior. They don't respond in a symmetric way. They don't say, well, we're getting more decent treatment from America or the Europeans, that will respond in kind. I think they view the concessions by the West as a sign of weakness. And you know, historically, it's not strength that's provocative when viewed by authoritarian regimes. Weakness is provocative. So the more weakness we show, the more likely the Ayatollahs will cause us trouble. It seems to me this is the critical lesson that we face right now as we see President Biden and his administration desperately negotiating in Vienna to return to the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. This is a catastrophic mistake. The nuclear deal, as we all know, was in effect not a constraint on the Ayatollah's desire to get nuclear weapons, but an incentive. They have taken advantage of it. We know from the raid by the Mossad that lifted significant parts of the nuclear archive from a warehouse in Tehran, that under the Ahmad plan, the regime was pursuing a crash nuclear weapons program. They have done enormous amounts of research, all of which is now available to them to pick that program up in full view of the world if they choose. And we've also seen significant evidence of the clandestine efforts by the regime that are still unknown to the International Atomic Energy Agency and still unknown even to Western intelligence agencies. The regime has not stopped its pursuit of nuclear weapons. They have not only not made a strategic decision to forego the pursuit of nuclear weapons, I think all of the evidence is they remain even more determined to continue to achieve that objective. Of course, the Supreme Leader and President-elect Raisi want the United States to rejoin the nuclear deal. They want relief from the U.S. unilateral sanctions, which have had such a significant effect on the economy. But they are planning to do exactly what the regime did in 2015. They will pledge to halt the nuclear weapons program in exchange for relief from the sanctions. And then when the money is unfrozen, when the trade has resumed, when the regime has reaped all of the benefits of the elimination of the sanctions, then the work on the nuclear program will simply continue. This is the playbook of regimes like Iran, like North Korea, and we shouldn't expect anything different this time around. I want to say here that the efforts of the MEK over the years to discover the secrets of the regime and its nuclear weapons program, its ballistic missile program, and making those pieces of information public have had a profoundly positive impact on the global debate about the threat posed by the regime. Without many of those discoveries, and very importantly, without making them public, people would not appreciate how dangerous the mullah's regime is and what a threat it poses, certainly at the nuclear level, but also at the level of terrorist support and conventional forces. So as we have a new administration in Washington, it's fair to ask, what should American policy be? My views on this have not changed since the first time I had the privilege of addressing this group almost 15 years ago. We can say right now the United States should not re-enter the JCPOA. It ought to continue efforts to expose the fallacies of that agreement and the dangers that it poses. The United States should not lift its economic sanctions. They should continue in place, and we should aid the people of Iran who are legitimate opponents of the regime, who seek nothing more than freedom and the opportunity to pick their own government, and who seek a non-nuclear weapons future for Iran. That is the role of the United States, to support the legitimate opposition. And our declared policy, our declared objective should be to overthrow the regime of the mullahs and replace it with a popularly elected government of the Iranian people. Thank you once again for being with you, and I hope next time it'll be in person.
سخنرانی مایکل موکیزی، وزیر دادگستری آمریکا 2009.
Thank you. Mrs. Rajavi and other freedom fighters in Ashraf, in Iran, and outside Iran, thank you for allowing me to participate in this important conference and to help bear witness to the fact that the spirit of resistance is not diminished by the desperate flailing of the mullah's regime and by their attempt to extinguish the flame that you represent. We're gathered here in a setting that's partly virtual because of the coronavirus pandemic, but the issues that Iran confronts and that we deal with are not virtual, they're very real. They're issues presented by the selection of a mass murderer, Ibrahim Raisi, to be the president of the Iranian regime. They're issues presented by the exposure in a Belgian courtroom of the plot of the regime to bomb the Iran rally, the Free Iran rally in 2018 near Paris. And they are issues presented by the need now to support the democratic opposition to install a secular, democratic, and non-nuclear republic in Iran. You may notice that I said the selection rather than the election of Ibrahim Raisi. That is because the so-called election, as we heard, was in fact a hollow exercise, a sham, to make sure that Raisi was picked. And look who they've chosen. Ibrahim Raisi was a prominent member of the death commissions that organized the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran in 1988, most of them members of the MEK, on direct orders of the then supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Raisi has not denied his participation in that atrocity. He has in fact boasted about it. This is not someone that any decent person or government should negotiate with. This is someone who we should insist be put before an international tribunal and made to answer for his deeds. And here I join Prime Minister Johnson of Slovenia, who courageously called for Raisi to be tried and incurred the wrath and the criticism of the Iranian regime. That wrath and criticism does not stain the Prime Minister's record. He should wear it as a badge of honor. Some people suggest that we should not demand that Raisi be tried for his crimes because that will make it difficult for him to negotiate or impossible for him to negotiate his way out of power. But Raisi has no intention of negotiating his way out of power. He takes pride in his record, and he claims that he has always, in his words, defended the people's rights, security, and tranquility. In fact, the only tranquility that Raisi has ever defended is the tranquility of the grave, of the graves of the 30,000 victims of his perfidy. He does not represent a regime that can change. He represents a regime that must be changed by the Iranian people and those in solidarity with them. If any further proof were needed as to the character of this regime, it's readily available in the record of the trial of Asadollah Assadi that concluded this year in a Belgian court. Assadi was an Iranian diplomat convicted of using his diplomatic cover himself to fly a bomb from Iran to Europe that was to be exploded at a Free Iran rally near Villepinte at the end of June of 2018. That bomb was intended to kill Mrs. Rajavi and many of the dignitaries who are participating in this meeting today, who were in attendance at that rally in 2018. It's impossible to exaggerate the importance of that trial and that verdict. What it proved was that a regime diplomat, Asadollah Assadi himself, personally carried the bomb from Iran and handed it over to two accomplices, taught them how to use it, and then checked with them to make sure that the plot was proceeding. The investigation by a joint operation of French, German, and Belgian police concluded that this was a state decision, not the personal initiative of any individual participant. The operation was approved by the National Supreme Security Council, headed by then President Rouhani, supposedly a moderate. This was state terrorism, not just state-sponsored terrorism, but a direct act of the regime to commit a terrorist act outside Iran. This was the first time that an official of the regime was literally caught in the act. And the conviction of the regime's diplomat, Assadi, for trying to perpetrate a bombing show that this is not a regime that will behave like a normal government, one that adheres to internationally recognized norms. The only way to end this regime's behavior is to end this regime. It's important now to keep in mind that those who rally across Iran to protest the difficult economic conditions that prevail in that country do not direct their protests against the United States or against any other country that has imposed sanctions. They direct their protests explicitly to the mullahs. They have said that the enemy is the mullahs, and they lie when they say it is America. And those protesters have also shouted, "Down with Khamenei." There is a ready democratic alternative to the corrupt and terrorist regime of the Ayatollahs. It is the NCRI, with its 10-point program for a democratic, secular, non-nuclear republic that guarantees equal rights for all people, men and women. The NCRI, headed by Mrs. Rajavi, who has tirelessly fought to bring to bring those goals about. We're here to rally support for that alternative and for the efforts of Mrs. Rajavi to end the nightmare that Iranians have been living in since 1979. We're all ready to help that effort. Our fondest hope is that that effort succeed and that we celebrate its success in a free and democratic Iran. I can think of no more appropriate way to close these remarks than with the cry of a few of the freedom fighters we heard from and of my friend Joe Lieberman. Hazer, Hazer, Hazer.
Dear Judge Mookezi, Ambassador Bولتون, I thank for the speeches of long-time friends and supporters of the resistance. As you said, the fact is that the right policy towards the religious fascist regime is decisiveness, negotiate in order to control regime's nuclear ambitions, is nothing more than a mirage, and the result is to give the regime free hand to continue to develop bomb and export terrorism and make the region and the world more insecure. I hope Europe and the United States open their eyes to this fact with the appointment of an executioner as president. It is time to bring the leaders of this criminal regime to justice and prosecute them for crime against humanity and genocide. Thank you all very much.